All right, guys and gals, hope everyone's doing okay today. We are going to start I guess this is the last topic that we'll cover before your first midterm exam, which, if I'm reading the calendar right, is coming up next Monday. So that'll be an in-class exam, hour and 15 minutes. I talked a little bit about this in the last class, I think. It's about 15 or so multiple choice questions and maybe some free response type questions as well. I think if you guys go back over the slides and the readings and work the practice problems that are online, you should do just fine. But if you have any questions about it, you're certainly welcome to email me. I haven't had any takers this semester, but I'm certainly willing to meet with folks online through Zoom for office hours if you need that before the first exam as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started then. Today we're going to move into this topic called measuring the cost of living. So in the last topic that we finished discussing last week, we talked a lot about gross domestic product, right, as a measure of the market value of the goods and services that an economy can produce. We spent some time talking about how real GDP in particular, as opposed to nominal GDP, is a pretty good measure of the kind of overall health of the economy. Now, it's not a perfect measure, right? We spent the last part of the last class talking about several ways in which GDP is at best an imperfect measure of the kind of health of society. But it does a pretty good job of at least explaining or telling us information about kind of the average income levels of people in a country. Today, we're going to change gears a little bit and examine, instead of talking about real GDP, we're going to look at what economists refer to as the cost of living, and specifically how economists try to measure the overall cost of living. So in today's talk and in the next class, we're going to be primarily concerned with the prices of goods and services, and in particular, how those prices can change over time through the process of inflation, right? We're going to be less interested in the actual quantities of goods and services that are being produced and sold. More interested in the prices of those goods. Now, the measure of the cost of living that we're going to focus on is something that I'm sure you guys are familiar with, you've heard of before. It's called the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. Just like GDP is the headline measure of economic activity that people reference, the CPI is typically the headline measure of the cost of living or inflation that people in the media, policymakers, politicians look to when they're thinking about the changes in the cost of living over time. That's one reason why studying the CPI is important. All right, it's so frequently referenced in the real world. The other, and I think actually more important reason why we want to study the CPI is because the information that is contained in the CPI is going to help us be able to make meaningful comparisons of dollar figures, not only at different points in time, but also in different geographic locations that might be experiencing differences in the cost of living. Okay, let me give you a quick example. So, Matt, let's suppose that you graduate from college and you start your job and you're making $100,000 a year in salary, okay? Even though you're a young guy, you want to start planning for your retirement, okay? And so ultimately when you retire at 65 or 70 years old, whatever, you would like to at least maintain your same standard of living. That is, be able to have income that is worth, so to speak, $100,000 a year. As you're saving over time, do you think that you're going to need to have actually more than $100,000 or less than $100,000 in retirement per year, which for you is not going to occur for another at least 40 years? If your goal, to be clear, is to maintain the same standard of living. That's right. So, and I think your intuition is correct there. If inflation is positive, if stuff generally gets more expensive, then to afford $100,000 worth of goods and services per year is going to take you much more than $100,000 per year 40 or 45 years from now, right? And that's because of inflation. Well, a lot of times in economics, we want to make comparisons about the real value of a dollar amount, for instance, a salary or a cost, at different points in time. Well, those comparisons are difficult because the prices of goods and services change over time with inflation. Fortunately, the CPI allows us to, or we can use a simple formula, I should say, that is based on the CPI that allows us to make these kinds of valid comparisons across time. For instance, how much is $10 today? How much was that worth 10 years ago? Well, we can do an adjustment using the CPI. And we won't get to that today, but we will do several exercises like that in the next class. And in fact, we'll apply it to look at some actual data on the real cost increases of college tuition in this country over the past close to 30 years now. Another thing that the CPI allows us to do is compare costs in different geographic locations, right? So Matt, you may have, let's say your first job offer is in Charlotte, North Carolina, right? Well, then a couple of years later, you might get a comparable job offer in New York City. But in order for you to want to take that job, you need to make sure that whatever income you're earning in New York City has the same real purchasing power as what you're currently getting in Charlotte, okay? The CPI allows us to make those kinds of adjustments by taking into account differences in the overall cost of living in different places. So not just intertemporally, that is over time, but also in different regions of the country. Okay, you guys have any questions then before we get started? Let's go ahead and start then with a definition. And then we will we'll discuss exactly how we compute the CPI. So I guess just a brief outline for what I want to try to accomplish today. Basically, two things. I want you guys to understand how it is the government statistical agencies compute the CPI, how it's put together. Okay, and we'll go through an exercise that involves that. But then I want to spend some time talking about how the CPI is just at best an imperfect measure of the cost of living. Just like GDP doesn't perfectly capture economic well-being, the CPI is not going to perfectly capture changes in the cost of living that we actually experience. And so I want to talk about some of those economic problems that are tied to the CPI. And that's probably about as much as I'll get through today. Okay, let's first start with a basic definition. What exactly is the Consumer Price Index? Well, the CPI essentially measures the overall cost of goods and services that are bought by the typical consumer. And by typical consumer, I kind of mean just the average consumer. All right, now, let me elaborate on that a little bit. There really is no such thing as a typical or average consumer, right? Everybody in this room buys a unique bundle of different goods and services every single month, right? The stuff that I buy is not the same as the stuff that, what's your name again? Josh buys, right? Is not the same as the goods and services that Sam buys, right? We all buy different things. What the CPI attempts to do is determine the cost of the typical basket of goods and services that the average consumer is buying. So if we were to kind of average all of the goods and services that we're buying together into one typical bundle, then the cost of that would tell us something about the Consumer Price Index. Okay, now that sounds a little complicated. So let me talk about the actual steps that the government uses to calculate the CPI. By the way, the agency that computes the CPI is known as the Bureau of Labor Statistics, okay? housed in Washington, D.C. The first step in this process is to fix the basket in the CPI. Okay, so what the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, has to do is they have to determine which prices are going to receive the most weight or be the most important in that average basket of goods and services. Now, how do they do this? There's no easy way to do this. The analysts for the BLS have to roll up their sleeves and basically survey thousands and thousands of different households across the country every single month. And in those surveys, they ask them a battery of questions about their income, about what kinds of goods and services they're buying, and in what quantities. I've actually looked at this micro level data before, and it's pretty impressive, the list of questions that they're asking and the details they get on people's buying patterns. What the BLS tries to do is conduct a random sample that is representative of the US population. And I think it's something like 50 or 60,000 different households across the country every single month. Now, based on these survey responses, the BLS is going to determine what the average basket of goods and services of the typical consumer is, right? And that's going to be what the CPI calls its average shopping basket, okay? Now, let me just ask you guys a conceptual question here. Which product do you think is going to receive a larger weight in the CPI basket? Paper towels or fireworks? Fireworks are much more expensive than paper towels per unit, right? But which do you think is going to have a larger weight or larger amount of importance in the construction of the CPI? Probably paper towels. Why? Simply by virtue of the fact that they're purchased with much more frequency than fireworks are, right? Most people don't buy any fireworks every year. Only a small set of people actually buy them, and they only buy them once a year, right? Pretty much everybody has to buy a regular consumer product like paper towels. And so the more often a good is purchased, the bigger the weight that's going to have in the consumer bundle. Sean, do you have a question? I'm sorry? Oh, the government statisticians will call you and conduct a survey. Now, some of it may be online, some of it's over the phone, and they ask you questions. If you agree to participate, they ask you a whole lot of questions about what you purchased over the past month and in what quantities, and also a ton of other demographic characteristics and income characteristics so they can get a representative sample of the whole US economy. So these CPI numbers are estimates based on a random sample of US consumers. But that sample is as large, I believe, as like 50 or 60,000 households per month. Okay, the next thing that the BLS does after they've fixed the basket, right? So imagine the BLS surveys this room and they discover that I purchase 5 apples per year. Per month. Sam purchases 10 apples per month. But Neff here she hates apples. She purchases 0 per month, okay? We all have a different preference over that product, that good. What the BLS does is they average all of those together to determine that the typical consumer, in this example, would buy 5 apples per month, right? Just the average of 0, 5, and 10. So that's conceptually how it's done, except they do that to literally thousands and thousands of different consumer products and services. Okay, so what is the next step after the basket of goods is determined? Well, they have to find the prices. And here's the other difficult part of this task. What the BLS has to do here is literally send analysts out into the field to collect data on the prices of all of these different goods and services every single month, okay? Once they've recorded all of those prices and they've determined what the average basket is, then they can compute the basket's cost. Well, that's easy to do, right? you simply take the quantities and multiply them times the prices that you observed, and you add them all up, and you can determine then what the total cost of the typical bundle of goods and services in the economy is. Sean? I don't think so. I'm a macroeconomist, so I don't deal with proprietary firm level data. But my understanding of it is that they're very protective of that information. They don't like to give it to anyone. So I don't think they do that, no. It might make things more convenient, but then again, stores would have to record your identity and also record a bunch of other characteristics about you. I imagine over time, as people's data becomes more available, that these kinds of things might get easier to do. Okay, step 4 then, we are ready to compute the CPI. It's pretty straightforward, okay? The CPI is given by the formula in this yellow square or rectangle here. The CPI is defined as the cost of the basket in the current year divided by the cost of that same basket in a base year times 100 to express this as an index number. So just like the real gross domestic product, the CPI involves choosing a base year or a reference year that you're going to compare prices against over time. Whatever that CPI number is going to tell you essentially how much the prices of the goods that are in this basket have changed relative to the base year. In an application on an exam, I will of course tell you what the base year is. That won't be a mystery. One other thing I want to mention about this before I get to the next point. Notice the subtle difference here between CPI and real GDP. I have a handful of principal students that screw this up every year. I don't want it to happen to you, okay? In calculating CPI, what is it that you hold fixed from the base year to the current year? You hold the quantities fixed, right? And allow the prices to adjust. That is exactly the opposite of what you do in computing real GDP, right? In real GDP, you value current quantities using base year prices. So real GDP involves keeping the prices constant over time, but varying the quantities. A few students every single year get those backwards, and when they're trying to compute the CPI, they let the quantities adjust and hold the prices fixed, and vice versa with GDP. So just be very careful about that, okay? The construction of the CPI is in a lot of ways the exact opposite of how you would construct the GDP, real GDP. Okay, last point I want to make. Because the CPI is a useful measure of the cost of living, we can use it to actually determine a country's inflation rate. Now remember, what is the difference between the cost of living and the inflation rate? They're related, but they're different in an important way. Inflation is how quickly the cost of living is rising or changing over time. So to compute an economy's inflation rate, you just apply the growth rate formula to the CPI. The CPI tells us something about the general level of prices or the cost of living in any given year. The inflation rate tells us how much the cost of living is rising from one year to the next. So inflation can be computed as the CPI from the current year minus the CPI from the previous year divided by last year's CPI times 100%. In the last section of this course, we used the GDP deflator as our measure of the price level or cost of living, and we use that to compute the inflation rate. The inflation rate can be computed in exactly the same way with the CPI. So that goes to show you that there's lots of different inflation rates that we can look at. Later on today, I hope to be able to compare actual US inflation using the CPI versus the GDP deflator, so you can see times in which they're quite different. Okay, questions so far? All this really easy? Good. All right, let's do an application together so that you can make these concepts really concrete. This should be pretty straightforward, okay? Like most of the examples in this class, we want to simplify the concepts down to like a too-good economy so that we can do the algebra and everything is easy. Let's pretend that we live in a world where we're just consuming two goods, beef and chicken, okay? We have the prices per pound of beef and chicken in these 3 years. $4, $5, then $9 for beef, and $4, $5, and then $6 for chicken, all right? Let's suppose that the BLS has surveyed the room and they have determined that the average or typical consumer in our pretend little economy here is consuming 10 pounds of beef per year and 20 pounds of chicken, okay? Here's what I want you guys to do. Simply compute the CPI in 2018, and then I want you to compute the CPI rate of inflation from 2018 to 2019. And since this is the first problem we've done, we can just do it together. That's fine by me. All right, so if we want to compute the CPI in 2018, what is the first thing we need to find out? So, the first thing you need to ask yourself, okay, what is the CPI? What's the formula for the CPI? It's the cost of the fixed basket in the current year, that would be 2018, divided by the cost of the same basket in the base year. So I tell you in the problem here that 2017, the first year that we have data on, is the base year. So the first thing we need to do is compute the cost of that CPI basket in the base year. And what is that going to be? Well, it's just $4 per pound of beef times 10 pounds of beef, plus $4 per pound of chicken times 20 pounds of chicken. So you just multiply the prices that you observe times the quantities that are in the fixed basket, and the CPI basket then in 2017 would be $120. If we want to compute the CPI for 2018 then, we need to figure out what the cost of the CPI basket is in 2018, and then divide that by this $120 figure, right? So what is the cost of the fixed basket of beef and chicken in 2018? Very easy. $5 was the price of beef in 2018 times 10 pounds plus $5 per pound of chicken times 20 pounds, giving us $150. So this particular combination then of beef and chicken went from $120 in 2017 to $150 in 2018. We now have the information we need to compute the CPI. It's just the cost in the current year divided by the cost in the base year times 100. The dollar signs will cancel, and so the CPI is units free. It's just an index number. And in this case, it would be equal to 125. See how easy that was? Okay, how do we get the rate of inflation then between 2018 and 2019? We'll make this a tiny bit more difficult. Matt? Okay, let me revise what you're saying. That's partial credit. If we want the rate of inflation between 2018 and 2019, then we need to calculate how much the CPI has gone up by percentage-wise between 2018 and 2019. So we know what the CPI is in 2018. The key step here is to compute now the CPI for 2019. Then we can apply the growth rate formula to those two numbers, right? So the CPI for 2019 is computed first by calculating the cost of the fixed basket in 2019. So it would be $9 per pound of beef times 10 pounds plus $6 per pound of chicken times 20 pounds. And so the CPI basket, Matt, in 2019 costs $210. It went up by quite a lot. So what is the CPI in 2019 then? It's 210 divided by the base year cost of the basket, which was 120, times 100, giving us 175. So that because the CPI went from 125 to 175, we know that goods and services got generally more expensive that year. We can figure out exactly how much by computing the rate of inflation. Okay, so Matt, I think this is probably what you meant, right? It's, in this case, it would be 175, that's the CPI from 2019, minus 125, that was the CPI from 2018 that we calculated in Part A, divided by 125 times 100%, giving us a 40% rate of inflation. So compared to the actual US economy, an extremely high inflation rate. Beef and chicken got a lot more expensive, in particular beef. Okay, is that pretty straightforward then? I'm sure that there will be some problem on your exam that asks you will give you, information about prices and quantities and ask you to compute something like a CPI or a CPI-based rate of inflation. So go over these again, make sure you're comfortable with knowing the formulas and how to apply them correctly. It's not tough, it just takes a little bit of practice. Okay, here's a picture I want you guys to take a look at and think about for a minute or two. Here is a pie chart that shows the composition of the CPI basket. And when did I get this data? This is based on July 2020 data for the US economy. So it essentially shows the breakdown of consumer spending for the average consumer, right? Which of course, your all's consumption is going to be different than the typical consumer. But if we were to average all consumption bundles across the country, that typical consumer that the CPI is focused on has a breakdown of her consumption spending that looks like this, okay? So what is obviously the largest component of the typical consumer basket in the US economy? It's going to be housing. So this is going to include things like your rent, your furnishings, your utilities. If you own the place you live, it will be the estimated rental value, right? We talked about that earlier. About 40% of the average household budget goes to housing related expenses. That's the biggest component of the CPI basket. According to the pie chart here, the second biggest component is food and beverages at about 15%, followed by transportation, right? Automobiles, fuel, parking, etc. I'm not going to ever ask you guys to memorize these numbers. I do want you to be kind of generally aware of which are the biggest components, maybe which are the next biggest and which are the smallest. Let me ask you this question. Based on this data, if there was a 1% increase, let's say, in the price of food, or alternatively, there was a 1% increase in the price of, let's say, apparel or clothing, which of those two is going to have a bigger effect on the CPI, you think? A 1% increase in the price of food and beverages, or a 1% increase in clothing inflation? Which will have a bigger impact on the reported CPI? Sean? Why? Exactly. Because food and beverages are bought in higher quantities than clothing, they're going to receive a larger relative weight in the CPI basket, okay? A 1% increase in housing costs will have a bigger effect on the CPI than a 1% increase in education and communication, right? Over time, by the way, this purple slice, medical care, has actually gone up quite a bit. When I first started teaching this class, God knows what, about maybe 10 years ago, This was like 5%, 6%. It's now 9%, right? Since this is a pie chart after all, that means as one slice gets bigger, necessarily there must be another slice or maybe multiple slices that are getting smaller. So one thing you might want to think about is that over time, if things like medical care or education perhaps become more expensive, then that means we're going to have less of our resources or our income that we can devote towards these other categories like housing or food. Neff? Yeah. That's a good question. And the answer is not obvious. I mean, yes, people are getting sick, but during the summer months, I also know that pretty much every hospital in the country shut down elective surgeries. So it's hard to say whether or not the pandemic is causing medical care prices to go up or down. I mean, usually what this is tied to is the cost of health insurance premiums, which have gone up at a faster rate than consumer price inflation overall. Okay, other questions? All right, so I think you guys have a good idea about how the CPI is calculated. You'll definitely need to be able to apply those formulas and understand those concepts on the exam. Let me switch gears here for a moment, and really for the rest of class, I'd like to focus on some of the problems or biases that the CPI has in trying to estimate or accurately reflect the true cost of living that typical consumers are experiencing. So the goal of the CPI here, again, is to measure how much our cost of living is going up by every month or every year. But it is not a perfectly accurate measure of the cost of living. There are some imperfections or flaws with the CPI that I want you guys to be aware of. Okay. Because what that means then is that if you read a headline measure of the CPI that says inflation is 3%, well, for a variety of reasons, our true cost of living might be more or less than 3% because of these biases that I'm going to talk about right now. The first one that is probably the most prevalent, I want to focus on the most, is what's called the substitution bias. Let me explain what that is, and then we'll go through an example or two illustrating this. It is just inevitable that over time, the prices of some goods and services are going to rise faster than others, right? Just like I talked about here with medical care versus other types of goods. When that happens, when the prices of different types of goods and services change at different rates over time, then the rational consumer is going to tend to substitute towards goods and services that are becoming relatively cheaper over time, and substitute away from goods and services that are becoming relatively more expensive. Consumers respond to price changes. When stuff gets more expensive, we tend to want to consume less of it in favor of cheaper items. All right, that's common sense. This action, however, is not adequately reflected in the CPI. And why is that? When the price of a certain good goes up and the next month we consume less of it because it's more expensive, why doesn't the CPI reflect that substitution away from the expensive product? Or in what sense does it not reflect it, Matt? Well, they not only do they generalize goods into categories, but the goods in the CPI basket are literally fixed from one month to the next, right? When we did this chicken beef example, as the prices of those goods changed over time, we just assumed that consumers, the typical consumer, was eating 10 pounds of beef and 20 pounds of chicken, or whatever it was, right? 10 and 10 maybe. But in reality, a lot of people tend to substitute towards goods that are becoming relatively cheaper. And the CPI doesn't pick up that dynamic very well because the fixed basket of goods and services that the CPI determines by conducting these surveys is not updated regularly enough. It is updated every now and then, but it's not updated every single month. And so to that extent, then, the CPI is going to tend to overstate the true increases in the cost of living. If the CPI measure of inflation says that prices rose by 2% this month, well, that may overstate people's actual cost of living because they've substituted towards cheaper goods and away from goods that are becoming relatively more expensive, right? So I'm a big fan of German beer. Like I like to buy imported German beer. If I see that imported beer prices doubled this month, then I'm probably not going to buy it, and I'll substitute towards maybe a domestic craft beer. Well, my cost of living has stayed the same because I've substituted towards an alternative product. But that action is not going to be reflected in the CPI, right? The CPI is going to indicate that the cost of the basket has gone up because it assumes that people are still consuming the same amount of imported beer. That's what we mean by the substitution bias. Let me, this article here is really interesting, and it touches a little bit, Neff, on something that you mentioned a minute ago. So the example I just gave you is one in which the substitution bias overstates the rate of inflation. However, during the pandemic, the substitution bias has actually understated what the true level of inflation is. Why do you think that might be the case? I've got time to do this. I'm going to exit here and go actually look at some economic data to show you what exactly I'm talking about, because I think this is actually pretty interesting given what's gone on recently with inflation. I'm going to go out to the website of the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. They have managed these huge databases of all different types of economic data. I'm going to take a look at the CPI, and I'm just going to focus on, let's say, the beginning of 2019 to the present. And let me edit this graph. Let me write this in terms of inflation so you guys can see what's going on here. So, okay, one sec. Let me make sure that I want to share my screen with the people who are viewing remotely. Sorry about how clumsy I am transitioning here. Here's the CPI rate of inflation from January 2019 through today. Take a look at what's happened here. So, according to the CPI rate of inflation, it was flat at around, that number looks a little bit large actually. That doesn't seem to be quite right. Hold on. Yeah, that's not the, hold on one sec. That is not the series I was looking for. Well, darn it. Let's see. Sorry. I don't know why. I think they must have changed the labeling of the data. I can't seem to find it right now. So anyway, sorry about that. Let me go back and share the screen real quick. No, no. Let me just ask you the question anyway, without actually seeing what the data looks like. I'll just tell you, take my word for it, that inflation, as measured by the CPI, fell quite substantially during the early months of this year. So it was somewhere around 2% in January and February, and then it collapsed to like 0% in March, April, and May. Now, how many of you guys actually think the real level of inflation that you were experiencing was 0% during those early months of the pandemic lockdown? Why is it that you think maybe that the CPI inflation numbers were suggesting that? Any ideas? Sean? Well, so certain goods that the typical consumer was purchasing, things like household furnishings, clothing, airline tickets, travel, gasoline, restaurant meals, the prices of those goods when the economy was on lockdown fell substantially, right? But even though they fell dramatically, people weren't getting on airplanes, for instance. Hardly anyone was buying new household furnishings, right? So the CPI measure of inflation fell dramatically during the lockdown, even though people's actual cost of living didn't change that much because they weren't going to be purchasing those goods anyway. This is a unique example that is kind of the opposite direction of what I've talked about here in the slides. Usually we think of the substitution bias as causing the CPI to overstate the true cost of living increase. But during the pandemic, it actually understates what our true level of inflation is because people aren't buying these goods anyway. I would encourage you guys to take a look at that article. There's also a recent op-ed on the same topic that's even more in depth that I saw recently in the New York Times. If anybody's interested in that, I can forward you that particular article. So the substitution bias has played a really big role in distorting the inflation numbers during this whole COVID-19 experience. Let me do a quick exercise with you guys to illustrate quantitatively how significant the substitution bias is by going back to our beef and chicken example. So if you guys recall, the CPI basket there was 20 pounds of beef and I'm sorry, 20 pounds of chicken and 10 pounds of beef. Let's do a simple experiment here. Let's suppose that in 2017 and 2018, households in our survey actually consumed this CPI basket. All right, so 10 pounds of beef, 20 pounds of chicken. However, in 2019, behavior changed. In that year, households actually only bought 5 pounds of beef and 25 pounds of chicken. And they did that, why? Because you can see from the table here that beef prices went up dramatically in 2019. Chicken prices didn't go up nearly as much. So the relative price of chicken has gone down compared to beef. Okay, I want you guys to compute the cost of the 2019 household basket. That is the actual goods that we bought, not what was in the fixed CPI basket. And then use that number to compute how much our true cost of living went up by that year. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward then. In 2019, what did households actually buy? They bought 5 pounds of beef at $9 a pound, and they bought 25 pounds of chicken at $6 a pound. And so what we actually paid in 2019 then for our food was $195. In contrast to, what was it, $210 based on the CPI basket. And so if we want to compute the percentage increase in the cost of the goods that we actually bought, then we just subtract $150 from $195 and divide that by the cost of the goods we bought in 2018, which was $150, which tells us that the true cost of living that we experienced was only 30% higher because we've substituted away from beef into chicken. Whereas the CPI rate of inflation that doesn't take that substitution into account told us that the cost of living went up by 40%. So this is a simple little quantitative example that shows the magnitude of the substitution bias, right? If you don't take into account the fact that consumers are going to try to shop for the cheaper goods, you're going to tend to overstate what the true level of inflation is. Okay, you guys have any questions then about that? The next issue with the CPI that I want to touch on here a little bit is what's known as the bias or the problem associated with the introduction of new goods. So in a dynamic market-based economy like we have in this country, there are new goods that enter the market all the time. I don't know the exact numbers, but I imagine hundreds of new goods enter the market every single month, okay? Now, when that happens, when new goods enter the market and old goods are taken out of the market, typically what happens as a result of that is it improves or increases the varieties that consumers have available to them, okay? Now, that's a good thing. A country or an economy that has a greater variety of goods and services is better. Why? Because the more variety of goods and services you have, the better you're going to be able to match your income with your preferences, right? So greater variety improves our standard of living, improves our welfare, because we can better match our own individual consumer preferences. Okay, the implication here then is that this makes each dollar that we're spending more valuable because we're going to better be able to meet our own individual preferences, right? So another way of thinking about this is that if varieties increase because there are new goods that enter the market, then the real value of our money is going to go up, and we're going to be able to attain a higher standard of living given the same amount of money, because we're better able to meet our own specific preferences due to the increase in variety, okay? The CPI, once again, is going to miss this dynamic, and for the same reason that it has a problem dealing with the substitution bias. And that is because the CPI is based on a fixed basket of goods and services over time. It's not updated regularly enough in order to always account for the introduction of these new goods. And so to the extent then that there are a lot of new goods that enter into our economy that improve varieties, the CPI is going to tend to overstate the true increases that we experience in the cost of living. When I was growing up, there was only two kinds of M&Ms, right? You could get the chocolate M&Ms or you could get the peanut M&Ms, right? Well, you go into the gas station now and you look at the candy aisle and you see that there's probably 10 different types of M&Ms, right? There's not just chocolate and peanut M&Ms anymore. There's pretzel, there's mint, there's caramel, there's peanut butter, there's coffee flavor, there's a bunch of different types, right? That's like the introduction of new goods, right? So even though a pack of M&Ms, the price hasn't actually gone up because there's greater variety, we're able to match people's individual preferences better, and the true cost of obtaining a given standard of living then is going to go down. So improvements in, the introduction of new goods leads to greater variety and lower costs of living. One last one that I think is actually very important, and that is problems that the CPI has with picking up changes in quality over time. A lot of times these changes in the quality of goods and services can't be measured really accurately, okay? So let me ask you guys this. What happens to the value of our money if the quality of the basic goods and services that we consume is improving over time? If the prices of goods are constant, or even if the stuff that we consume is getting more expensive, but prices aren't rising as fast as the quality of those goods is rising, then what happens to the value of our money? John? It's going to go up, right? And so the amount of money then it takes to get a specific amount of a specific value of standard of living then is going to go down. And so to the extent then that there are unmeasured quality changes in the goods that we're purchasing, and I say unmeasured meaning that they're not fully reflected in the prices of those goods, the CPI is going to again tend to overstate the true cost of living. Now, I will say that the BLS tries to account for these quality changes. When the analysts go out into the field and they record prices, they try to make note of whether the quality of these goods has changed over time, and they adjust the prices accordingly. But they're invariably going to miss some of the quality improvements. And so the true CPI numbers then are going to tend to overstate inflation. There's a nice article in the Wall Street Journal that illustrates this point, called "Americans Are Richer Than We Think." And the primary driver of that is that the quality of the goods and services we're consuming today, even though they're more expensive, the quality far exceeds the goods and services that were consumed in generations past. And so in that sense, we're a lot richer, right? You can take automobiles, for example. Even though your standard automobile today is going to cost more than it did, 10 or 15 years ago, the quality of these cars is going to be higher. There's nicer features inside. The materials are better and more durable. And so to the extent that the quality is not perfectly reflected in the price of those cars, the CPI will tend to overstate the true cost of living. Okay, any questions then about that? So we've accomplished two things today. One, we've defined what the CPI is, and we've worked through a specific example of how we construct it and how we can compute an economy's inflation rate using the CPI. We've spent some time now talking about some reasons why the CPI is not a perfect measure of the cost of living. There are three known problems with the CPI: the substitution bias, the introduction of new goods, and these unmeasured quality changes. So be familiar with those. The last thing I want to do today is go back and do some actual comparisons between the CPI and another measure of prices that we talked about in the last class, which was the GDP deflator. Here is a graph of the level of inflation in the US economy from 1950 to 2019 based on two different concepts. The blue line is the GDP deflator, and the red line is the consumer price index. Now, if you just casually glance at this graph, you will see that they tell a very similar story about inflation in the United States, right? During the 60s and 70s, for example, inflation was a big, big problem, right? It was getting higher and it was really volatile. It would spike up and then spike down and then go and then surge back up again, right? In the early to mid 70s, inflation would go from like 3% all the way up to above 10% over a relatively quick period of time. I mean, you guys and myself, I haven't experienced anything like that ever, right? After the early 1980s, through the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, you see that inflation in the U.S. economy was behaved very differently, right? Inflation fell dramatically and became much more stable. It fluctuated around, but it wasn't nearly as volatile as it was in the 60s and 70s, right? Today, inflation tends to kind of hover around 2% per year. Although the two series here tell us something very similar about the US economy, they're not always exactly the same. There are certain episodes, in fact, where the CPI rate of inflation is quite different than the GDP deflator rate of inflation. Look at the late 70s, for example. According to the GDP deflator, inflation was around 9% or so, but given by the CPI, it was closer to 14%. So occasionally there are these big gaps between what the CPI and the GDP deflator are telling us about what's happening to underlying inflation. I want to try to discuss why that might be the case, but to do that, I think it's important that we go through some of the conceptual reasons why CPI might be different than the GDP deflator. Both of them are supposed to tell us something about the cost of living or the general level of prices, but in what circumstances would they actually be quite different? Okay, well, the first way in which these two are going to be different is, of course, how imported goods are treated. The price of imported goods is going to be reflected in the CPI. And why is that? Because the typical US consumer purchases a fairly large share of goods that are produced abroad. But the price of imported goods is not going to be reflected in the GDP deflator. Why? Because the deflator is calculated based on gross domestic product, which excludes foreign produced goods and services. We subtract out imports from the equation. So anytime the price of imported goods changes a lot, that can cause the CPI rate of inflation to be quite different than what the GDP deflator rate of inflation might be. Think about that when we go back and look at the graph here in a minute or two. Another way in which these two differ is the treatment of capital goods as well as goods that the government purchases. So the price of a Chinook helicopter used by the United States Army, if the prices of those things went up, that would be included in the GDP deflator, right? Because the government spending is a component of GDP. But it would be excluded from the CPI. Why? The typical consumer doesn't buy any quantity of Chinook helicopters, right? And so if the prices of things that the government buys, and also capital goods, right? If equipment gets a lot more expensive, that's going to be reflected in the GDP deflator, but it won't be directly reflected in CPI because your average consumer is not purchasing a lot of capital equipment. One last way in which they're different that I think is important and ties this all together with some of the problems that the CPI has in measuring the cost of living is this idea about using a fixed basket versus a current basket of goods and services. The CPI, of course, uses this fixed basket to evaluate the cost of living over time. And so the CPI is vulnerable to the substitution bias. We talked at length about this. What about the GDP deflator? The GDP deflator, remember, is nominal GDP divided by real GDP. both of them account for currently produced goods and services. And so when you're evaluating the deflator over time, it's not going to be as vulnerable to that substitution bias. It will pick up the fact that people are buying more chicken this year instead of beef because chicken prices are a lot lower, right? So the CPI is biased heavily by the substitution effect, whereas the GDP deflator is not biased as much. That's going to matter if the different prices are changing by different amounts over time. So if relative prices are changing a lot, that's going to affect the CPI inflation rate more so than the GDP deflator. Okay, let me go back to this picture here in the time remaining, and let me throw this to you guys. Can you guys give me any reason why the CPI measure of inflation might be quite a bit higher than GDP deflator inflation in the late 70s? Sean? Yeah, so during the early to mid 70s, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, formed, which was a cartel among several countries in the world that depended heavily on oil exports for their finances. They got together and they started to restrict the global supply of oil, and they did so with the objective of raising oil prices. Okay, and it worked, right? We had the oil crisis of the 1970s, the energy crisis. You can ask your parents about it, where people were waiting in line for gasoline. There were fuel shortages all over the place. Prices were a lot higher than they used to be. Well, at the time, the United States was importing a lot of already refined oil, that is gasoline, automobile fuel. And so if imported fuel prices increased a lot, that would show up in the CPI. That's a product that consumers are buying in large quantities, but it wouldn't show up in the GDP deflator because it is an imported product. There are those kinds of episodes that can happen over time that can cause there to be a gap between these two measures of the inflation rate. During the mid-80s to early 90s, when OPEC was crumbling, to be quite honest, and oil prices were falling globally, you got the same kind of dynamic going on there. So actually, but it wasn't as great because the gap between the two was much smaller. But they're not always going to be exactly equal. There are certain times where they're really, really close. You can see the lines are basically right on top of each other. But there are other points where they can be a percentage point or two away from one another. Okay, any questions about that? Let me do one last review exercise for you guys to kind of test your knowledge about this, and then I'll let you go. So in each of these examples, I want you to tell me the effects on the CPI and the GDP deflator. So what if Starbucks raises the price of its Frappuccinos? Will that show up in the CPI, the GDP deflator, or both? Certainly a consumer product, domestically produced, it's likely going to affect both of those measures of inflation, right? How about part B? Caterpillar raises the price of industrial tractors it manufactures at its Illinois factory. Will that show up in the GDP deflator or the CPI or both directly? Sean? Just the GDP deflator. Why? Because not many typical consumers are purchasing industrial tractors. How about C? Armani raises the price of Italian jeans it sells in the United States. CPI or the deflator? CPI, right? That's an imported good. It's part of the typical basket of goods and services that the CPI uses, but it's not going to be part of gross domestic product. So it won't be reflected in the GDP deflator. Okay, that's kind of the last skill or concept that I want you guys to take from this class, is that We've talked about these two measures of the cost of living. A lot of times they reflect the same information, but there are instances in which they differ, and it's helpful to know kind of why that is. I think this slide here summarizes where those differences come from nicely, okay? All right, so that's all for today. We will finish this section in the next class. We'll have some time to work some more applications together, and then that will be it before your first exam.